Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Getting a Handle on Debt, Understanding Debt Resolution versus Bankruptcy, sponsored by Achieve, a leader in digital personal finance. My name is Linda Williams, and I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action and your host for the day. On behalf of Consumer Action Executive Director Anna Flores and the entire staff at Consumer Action, welcome. I am so excited. I am pumped about the conversation we are about to have on getting a handle on debt. Question: what do you do when you're drowning in debt? When you can't sleep because you're worried your next paycheck won't be enough to provide for your family. And it feels like the world is caving in around you. You're on a budget, check. You cut back on the extras, the lattes, check. You cut back on the expenses, check. You're not taking on any new debt, but your car is about to be repossessed, and it feels as if you're in quicksand, sinking slowly. And it appears that your only option is maybe to reach for a bankruptcy as a lifeline to pull you out of the quicksand. But wait, not so fast. Filing a bankruptcy may not be your only option. And you need to know all of your options so that you can make an informed decision about your situation. So, what are the options? Well, lucky for us, today we have two experts from Achieve to help us better understand the difference between debt resolution and bankruptcy. Here with us today is Sean Fox. Sean is the Chief Revenue Officer and President of Resolution at Achieve. And Frederic Huynh is here. Frederic is the Vice President of Data Optimization at Achieve. So break out your pen and paper. Take that last sip of your coffee, strap in, buckle up, because we're bringing the fireworks today. Now, before I get too excited about today's webinar, I need to go over a few housekeeping items and update you on what's happening at Consumer Action. This is a 90-minute webinar. If you have any questions whatsoever for our guest speakers, put them in the chat box. At the end of Sean and Frederick's presentation, my co-worker Nelson Santiago is going to facilitate a question and answer segment. This is where we get to hear from you. So let's keep the conversation moving with your questions, okay? This webinar is being recorded and it will live in perpetuity on our YouTube channel. You will receive a link to the recording and all handouts by tomorrow afternoon, if not sooner. AFC professionals, you will receive the password to claim your 1.5 CEUs tomorrow as well. Now, at the end of today's webinar, you will receive a survey regarding today's session. We value your feedback, so please complete the survey and return it to us as soon as possible. In addition, as a bonus for attending today, you will receive a certificate of completion. Now, Consumer Action is presenting this webinar with funding for Achieve. So a shout out to Achieve. Thank you for supporting Consumer Action mission. Now, for those of you who are new to Consumer Action and are wondering, I wonder what they do over there at Consumer Action. We are an educational and advocacy organization. What do we do? As displayed there on the screen through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policy that promote fairness for all consumers, but especially for underrepresented consumers nationwide. So when you're on our homepage, you see that little burgundy link in the middle, that little button? Click on that button and you will land on our COVID-19 educational project page. There, you will find a ton of relevant, easy to use resources and tools for the communities that you serve. Now, let me review the roadmap with you quickly so you'll know where we're headed today. We open each and every training, regardless of whether it's virtual or in person, with a game. How much do you know? Today we have three true or false questions. Our goal with the questions today is to increase your understanding of debt resolution versus bankruptcy. After the game, I will introduce you to our guest speakers. The question and answer segment led by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back, tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action, and wrap up. So here is how the game is played. There are three true or false questions. First, I will read the question and you will use the chat box to answer each question. After I close the poll and take a look at the results, we're going to throw in a little twist today. We're going to have one of our experts, Freddie, tell you whether the statement is true or false. So we're going to do Ask the Expert today. And the person with the most correct answers, drum roll, please, he or she will receive the bragging rights. So how much do you know? So are you ready? Are you ready? Let's roll out that first question. Six years after enrolling in a debt resolution program, the typical graduate has a FICO score that is nearly 700. 700? Is that true or is that false? 6 years after enrolling in a debt resolution program, the typical graduate has a FICO score that is nearly 700. Okay, couple more seconds. Let's close the poll. Let's close the poll and take a look at the results. 58% of you think it is a true statement. 42% said, no, 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 nearly 700, that's a false statement. Well, let's turn to our expert, Freddie, and ask him if that statement, Freddie, is that statement true or false?
Yeah, Belinda, that statement is absolutely true. So more than happy you got it right. But basically, what we have found is that most of the clients who enrolled in a debt resolution program, 6 years later, their credit score has returned to the financial mainstream, which is close to 700.
Wow, thank you, Freddie. Audience, you're doing great. Let's roll out the next question. Question 2. A consumer enrolled in a debt resolution program has to pay upfront fees for the debt relief services. Is that true or is that false? A consumer enrolling in a debt resolution program has to pay upfront fees for the debt relief services. Is that true or false? Couple more seconds. I'm going to close the poll. Come on. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow. Freddie, 38% of our audience believe that it's a true statement, while 62% thinks it's a false statement. Can you tell the audience whether that statement is true or false?
Yeah, so the statement is false, and this is the reason why we wanted to put this question on is that there is a lot of this is one of the more popular misconceptions regarding debt resolution, one of the advantages of enrolling in a debt resolution program is that the consumer only has to pay fees when a settlement is agreed to, and if the consumer agrees to a settlement. So there are no upfront fees.
Wow, that is good to know. Thank you, Freddie. Audience, you're doing fantastic. Let's move on to the last question. Okay, this is our last question. Come on, let's go, audience. Debt resolution clients are less likely to take out a new mortgage 5 to 6 years after they start the debt resolution program than Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 filers. Is that true or is that false? Let me read it again. Debt resolution clients are less likely to take out a new mortgage 5 to 6 years after they start the debt resolution program than Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 filers. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow. Freddie, 35% of our audience believe that it's a true statement. 65% said that statement is false. So, Freddie, can you tell who's right, who's wrong? Tell us who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Linda, so it is a false statement, but let's put a couple of quick numbers behind it. One of the things that we've observed is that a little over 8% of debt resolution clients will open a new mortgage 5 to 6 years after they started a debt resolution program. So a little over 8%. Now, if we compare that to Chapter 7 filers, roughly about 5.5% will open a new mortgage there. And Chapter 13 filers only a little over 3%. So we definitely see a greater percentage of debt resolution clients um, uh, open a new mortgage well after their time in the program.
Great. Audience, thank you for playing along, and a special thanks to Freddie for creating the questions for us today. Now let's move on to our main attraction. Let me introduce you to our speakers and tell you a little bit about them. Sean Fox. Sean is the Chief Revenue Officer and President of Debt Resolution at Achieve. He has over 20 years of experience leading digital companies that specialize in financial services, real estate, insurance, and other consumer-facing industry. Previously, he served in the antitrust division of the Justice Department. Sean holds a JD from Georgetown Law School, a master's degree from Cambridge University, and he has 2 bachelor's degrees from Stanford. Let me introduce you to Frederic, who is the Vice President of Data Optimization at Achieve, the leader in digital personal finance. Previously, he spent over 18 years at FICO, where he oversaw the development, maintenance, and analytical support of the FICO score. That's right. He was the technical lead on our product, client support, regulatory, and legal issues surrounding the company's flagship product. Freddie has a Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics from Claremont McKinney in California, and a Master of Science in Operations Research from Stanford. Sean and Freddie, our audience is ready for you to tell them about their options when they are drowning in debt. So I'm going to give you control of the deck. Let me see, I'm give it to Freddie, and let me give it to Sean. And we are all ready to learn about the difference between bankruptcy and debt resolution, and all of the options available to consumers.
That is great. Thank you so much, Linda. Can everybody hear me? Or can you hear me, Linda? Just make sure
I
we're
hear
still connected here.
loud and clear. I hear you
Awesome.
loud and clear.
Great. First, I want to thank Linda Nelson for helping us get organized for this and really creating a great structure for this presentation. We are thrilled to be working with Consumer Action and being able to share this information today. We hope that it's the beginning of a long relationship, and we're really excited that so many folks are on the call today. Hopefully you'll find the information valuable for you and something that you can take into your communities and go out there and to help consumers make informed decisions, because that at the end of the day is the thing that I think we all strive to make happen, is to make sure that consumers are understanding the options and then they make the best decisions for themselves. So as we go through this presentation, we're going to share with you the pros and the cons, the upsides and the downsides of these different options. And we're going to try to do that in a format that allows you to ultimately compare them to each other in a way that would be applicable to a consumer that you'd be working with. And so you can easily and quickly kind of understand that framework, and you can then help assess with that individual's feedback about their situation and their needs and their desires, what options they should truly consider. So before we do that, I'm just going to quickly move us, just click there. Let's see if it'll move forward. So, okay, I moved forward. Awesome. So first, just a quick kind of high level review of what we do as a company. So, I'm not going to read every piece of this slide. What I would like to point out, though, is that the company is really focused on personal finance as a core, and specifically for everyday people who are struggling with financial challenges. We are really focused on what I would consider to be middle America, and there's a very wide group of folks that live in kind of that middle America space who do get access to credit, do have credit cards, mortgage, and so forth. But they will, at some point in their life, in their career, will have life events that may intervene and cause them to struggle with some of that debt, whether or not it's credit card debt or whether or not it's auto loan, whatever that situation might be, you start to struggle with some of that debt. We see life events like a lost job or a divorce or medical issue has become more and more critical kind of trigger for some of these moments where consumers have financial stress that's very significant. And it goes into distress at some points where you need to take action and you need to intervene, in some of the more extreme ways like bankruptcy. What we're going to talk about today is, how to acknowledge and recognize when that stress is starting to build, and then to identify solutions that you can use to kind of address it as early in the process as possible. And obviously, every person is different. We talk a lot about kind of personalized approaches, and every person is different in terms of their situation. What we'd like to help this group do, and what we try to do in our business, is to really use that interaction with the human being, as well as the technology and the data and the understanding of where they really are based on their credit reports, to have a dialogue about the solutions, to have a dialogue about the options, and then ultimately help them address their challenges with one of these solutions that we're going to talk about today. So that's kind of introduction as to who we are. We're excited again to be here working with consumer affairs. I'm sorry, consumer action. Okay, so I want to jump into the specifics of this presentation. And first, I'm going to talk about kind of context for what's been going on in our economy. And you'll see some of the headlines on this page, which won't surprise you. It's been an incredibly dynamic several years. And I'm going to talk about two phases. One, I want to talk about the factors during COVID that impacted consumers. And then I want to talk about the things that are starting to impact consumers more in the recent period, call it the last six to 12 months. When COVID occurred, there was a belief that consumers were going to be very stressed financially. And in fact, what happened was, in most cases, on average, what happened is exactly the opposite. A couple factors. One, discretionary spending for consumers as the economy kind of shut down reduced significantly. People didn't go out for meals as much. They didn't travel as much. And so the spending rates you saw decreased dramatically. The second thing that happened is the government took very aggressive action to strengthen the economy and support families and consumers during that period of time, as you saw from government payments and other programs that the government put into place. And that supported savings rates. It supported consumers that had, for example, lost jobs. There was enhanced unemployment, and consumers were buoyed by those efforts. In addition, the private industry forbear some of the collections that they were doing, and they didn't require repayment for a period of time. And so that had an impact. And then finally, the public forbearance, for example, around student loans, had a meaningful impact. You put all those things together, and it turned out that consumers during most of COVID were actually in a fairly healthy position in terms of their personal finances. Then we get to call it the last year or so. COVID is changing, where it starts to open up, the economy starts to open up. And with the end of COVID, the policies and the measures that have been put in place by the government were ending, and that stress started to build back. And in addition to kind of COVID related measures ending, we had another huge phenomenon, which was inflation, obviously started to kick in, which impacted everyone on this call, and everyone that you deal with. We go to the gas pump, we go to the stores, we just try to get by in life, and inflation is impacting us, causing a material increase in how much we're having to pay out, to live life. At the same time, and this is really important for those who have debt, in order to battle that inflation, the Federal Reserve increased interest rates. And those interest rates increases at the federal level rippled through the entire economy, as is designed and expected. And that led to higher interest rates on basically all lending products that that consumers engage with: credit cards, auto loans, personal loans. All of these would increase in terms of the interest rate paid, which has the effect of increasing what the monthly payment needs to be, and ultimately what the total debt for a consumer is going to be. So you can see these pieces building on top of each other: end of COVID policies, inflation kicking in, interest rates going up, and then you see the results here, that you've got significant increases in credit card debt and so forth. And then the final piece that is coming is student loan repayments will begin again as a result of the recent federal legislation that later this summer, those student loan repayments will kick back in. And so just a note on student loan repayments, I'm going to move to the next slide so you can just kind of look at these stats as well. But a note on the student loan repayments: the CFPB just put out a report that says that about 1 in 5 student loan borrowers have risk factors that suggest that they're going to struggle when these scheduled payments resume. So we're fairly confident that a meaningful chunk of the consumers they're going to have to start repaying have risk factors that put them in a place where they're going to be stressed by this. And 24% of all the folks in that CFPB survey said that their median monthly payments on all the non-student loan debts, for the credit card, the auto loans, and so forth, had increased by 24% compared to when the pandemic started. So if you go pandemic to just recently, when the CFPB did this survey, you had a 24% increase in overall debt loads, even outside of the student loans. So the bottom line is there's going to be a meaningful amount of need out there in the market to help consumers address their student or their loan and credit situation. And what we're going to talk about now is to walk you through 4 of those options, okay? And here are the 4 options that we're going to talk about. First is a debt consolidation loan. Second is credit counseling. Third is debt resolution. And then fourth is bankruptcy. So the way I would think about these 4 solutions is really as kind of a debt stress spectrum, okay? Think of the left side of this page being where the consumer has the least amount of debt stress. They have debt stress, and they want to take some action, but it's not putting them in a position where they've got to take some of the more aggressive interventions that we're going to talk about over to the right. If you move all the way to the right, bankruptcy is the most aggressive intervention in our minds, and we'll talk about why we feel that way. And each of these is kind of a step towards more stress as you move to the right, is the way I would think about it. So it may not be a perfect analogy, but hopefully that kind of frames up for you. So we're going to go from the kind of least intervention to the most intervention, and we're going to talk about various aspects of these, and we're going to give you the information for each of them in the same way. And you'll have this presentation afterwards, so you can go back and kind of look at it, because ultimately what we want you to be able to do is to be able to compare these to each other in a real structured way that you can then communicate to folks that you're trying to help out in the community. So let me tell you about debt consolidation loans. And many of you probably are well familiar with debt consolidation loans. They're effectively where a consumer will choose to take unsecured debts, typically, like think credit cards, and they're going to get a consolidation loan that essentially allows them to bring all of those debts into a single loan and allows them to pay off those other debts typically, and allows you to have one loan that you make a payment monthly. And often the goal would be to be out of debt over a certain period of time, call it 2 to 4 years. So if you think about consolidation loans, they're typically amortized loans that go out of 24 to 48 months, and they have a monthly payment that is fixed, and there's no concept of kind of monthly minimum payments where your balance can continue to go up. Instead, it is a structured way of paying down that debt that has a definite and finite end to it. Okay, this is a good solution for those consumers who have generally good credit. They're self-disciplined in how they will make their payments, full payments monthly, and that this will ensure that they don't go deeper into debt. So it's someone who has a plan and wants to execute on that plan for getting out of debt. All right, trying to click to the next. There we go. Okay, so I already mentioned kind of what it is, and I just to emphasize, the high interest debt is what you're trying to bring into a consolidation debt typically. It's going to be lower interest rate, and as a result, it should be something that costs you less over the period of time than if you kept paying, for example, monthly minimums and your debt was growing. So there's really multiple kinds of these consolidation debts. It could be a personal loan, could it be a home equity loan? You could even use a balance transfer card, for example, to consolidate down to a lower interest credit card. Let's say that you were paying 25% and 27% and 23% on 3 different cards, and you had a balance transfer that could maybe get you down to 0, or maybe it's 8% or 10%. But it allows you, again, to get it down to a single payment. And if you're disciplined about paying that off, you're going to be in a position where you have saved money ultimately compared to paying monthly minimums or even paying under the total max that you can pay on a credit card. So this new account, as I mentioned, is typically going to have lower interest rate. And it's really important that the consumers you're working with understand interest rates and that they understand the impact of those, as you can kind of build on the compounding interest. Of course, is an incredibly powerful concept and one that's hard to explain sometimes, but important to understand. As those balances of the unsecured debt are transferred into this lower account, you then deal with that one lower consolidated monthly payment, and it really makes it simplifies the process of managing that loan or those loans. So here are the aspects of each of these solutions that we want to talk about. How you qualify is one that we're going to talk about. So basically your eligibility criteria. And as we mentioned, good credit and someone who the lender believes is going to pay back that either loan or that balance transfer. And then fees. So how much does this cost? So obviously, depending on the loan, you could end up with any level of interest rate, and it will depend on what what the consumer's credit score is, and it can run a range. These are just some examples of what those numbers could be. One thing to know about the personal loan is that there oftentimes will be what they call an origination fee. And that origination fee could be anywhere from 1% to 5%. In this case, we're saying usually 3 to 5% of the total loan amount, and that will be charged up front. And so what you see is an interest rate that is a certain level, but then other fees and such that will combine to create an APR, which is effectively an annualized rate that takes into consideration the entire cost of that loan. And that's really, kind of the key number that consumers want to focus on is their APR, because it will take into account all of the aspects in terms of the cost of that loan. So what to watch out for? You will pay less interest when you have these single monthly payments, and that's a great thing about the consolidation loan. But it's still debt, and if you don't make the payments on time, and if you don't pay the full amount each month, you can end up in a similar position or worse position than if you're continuing to pay your credit cards. And specifically, the personal loans have a specific amount of time that you are going to pay them off. Typically, like I said, 2 to 4 years. As a result, sometimes when you take these loans out, you can end up having your monthly payment even go up compared to what you were paying as minimum monthly payments for your credit cards. So the consumer just needs to be very aware of what that monthly payment is going to be before they engage in a consolidation loan. You want to make sure that you don't put them in a worse position in terms of their stress, and then put them in a position where they might default on that loan, because that obviously is a loan that the lender will oftentimes try to collect on. And then the other thing to watch out on is, credit scores can increase or decrease depending on how you consolidate your debt. I think it's fair to say that if you consolidate the debt and you make the payments on time and effectively, then it's likely to improve your credit score. But there is some variability there. Freddie is the expert on credit score. So when we get to the end of this and we have some time, maybe we can talk about credit scores if people want to go into details there. Okay, let me jump to my next slide. Okay, great. So that is the consolidation loan. I hope that was clear and helpful. And Freddie, I'm going to hand it to you for credit counseling.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Sean. Hey, before I begin, I switched my audio. Can either one of the panelists or you, Sean, let me know if I'm coming in more clear now?
You are
much better.
perfect.
Yep.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little muffled earlier. So Sean was walking you through debt consolidation, and really the next logical solution for us to be talking about is credit counseling, and just there's going to be some elements of debt consolidation loans that are very similar to credit counseling, but there are some noticeable differences too, which we'll be talking about. All right. So the way that I think about, credit counseling is like, one aspect that they're very similar is that just as debt consolidation loans can move unsecured debt to a new account with a lower interest rate, a debt management plan that's been implemented by a credit counseling agency can reduce interest rates for a consumer as well, right? And so as Sean was saying, with debt consolidation loans, if the consumer has the self-discipline to kind of open this loan, and to kind of pay onto it, the credit counseling could be a more appropriate for solution for a consumer who doesn't necessarily have that self-discipline yet, where they can work, sometimes they need to work with an outside party to kind of help them get on track, and this is where credit counseling can be very effective. That being said, one of the things that we also kind of realize is that for some consumers, their debt may be so high that even a reduced monthly payment isn't going to be enough for them to eventually pay off their debt in its entirety. And as we go through the various solutions, we'll talk a little more about that.
Now, in terms of what is credit counseling? Basically, consumers can work with these credit counseling agencies who they will kind of engage with a trained credit counselor on a variety of financial health topics, whether it be budgeting, debt management, maybe even like considering bankruptcy or consumer credit as well. And in these consultations, they'll be able to help the consumer evaluate their individual situation and, more importantly, develop a plan. Okay. Now, what most people don't know is that though credit counseling agencies are nonprofit organizations, they are primarily funded by credit card companies. And so in addition to counseling on personal finance and even bankruptcy, a key offering from a credit counseling agency is the administration of DMPs or debt management plans. Okay. In terms of how it works, basically a credit counseling agency works with the consumers, creditors, lenders, to have their interest rates reduced and to have their fees waived while the consumer is in a debt management plan. And similar to a debt consolidation loan, the consumer makes one payment. However, instead of these payments going to one lender, the payment is sent to the credit counseling agency, whose responsibility in turn kind of disperses those payments to various creditors participating in the program. And so, as I said earlier, this may be a better solution than a debt consolidation loan for consumers who need that external help. They need that credit counselor to kind of help them stay on that kind of straight and narrow path and not racking up more debt, right? It's also important to know that debt management plans, they primarily help consumers with unsecured debt, and certain types of debt such as mortgage, other secured debt, or even student loan debt cannot be addressed in a debt management plan. All right. In terms of eligibility, how do you qualify for consumer credit counseling? Well, here, when the consumer works with a credit counselor, the consumer's financial situation will ultimately be assessed, and basically to determine whether or not if they're going to be a good fit for the DMP. And many debt management plans will require a minimum amount of unsecured debt in relation to the consumer's annual income, right? And so this is really important because the agency, the credit counseling agency, needs to know whether or not the consumer has sufficient income such that they can demonstrate a capacity to repay the debt, even though the debt's going to now have presumably a lower interest rate. Okay. One of the other things to kind of keep in mind is that many debt management plans have arrangements that will require the consumer to pay consistently. Otherwise, if they fail or if they kind of slip up, it's possible that their interest rates could revert back to their higher level. Okay. Now, in terms of fees, in terms of what does it cost, right? A DMP typically requires a startup or a setup fee, and there's also going to be a recurring monthly fee. That being said, as long as the relief from the interest rate reduction is large enough for the consumer to pay the debt back, these fees should not be prohibitive. Okay. Now, in terms of watch-outs, or like, hey, if I was a consumer and I wanted to, what would I want to know about, credit counseling? I think there's three things that we want to call out here. So first, though, credit, your credit score is not going to be penalized from working with a credit counseling agency, but that being said, it is important to know that there are lenders out there who will not lend to a consumer if there's evidence on the credit report that the consumer has worked with a credit counseling agency. And so what this means is that this could impact a consumer's ability to access credit while in the program. And it's just something for a consumer to kind of be aware of. The second point is that a DMP, a debt management plan, is only going to be effective if lenders kind of participate in the program, right? Now, and the reason why I bring this up is that there are some lenders who will require that all of the other unsecured creditors that are kind of found in your credit report are going to be participating in the program before they participate. So that's just another thing to kind of consider. Lastly, while you're in a debt management program, typically your credit cards are going to be closed. Some lenders have been known to go one step further, and they will actually terminate the program if they find out you've accessed new credit. On the other, on the other side of the spectrum, there are some programs that will allow you to keep one credit card as long as the balances don't revolve month to month. Though there are some questions on how well they can enforce that. But those are the three main things that we wanted to call out for on debt management plans. So Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you for debt resolution.
Great. Thank you very much. So, so we've covered 2 out of the 4, and just as a reminder, we're kind of moving towards even greater amounts of debt stress. So, imagine, a consumer in the first 2 scenarios had 3 or 4 credit card debts, and they had, $10,000 worth of total debt, and they were struggling to, make headway in terms of paying off that debt. Now we're talking about consumers that typically will have even more debt stress than that. In many cases, kind of the average debt resolution client would have $25,000 worth of debt, as an example, and on average, 8 accounts, including credit cards, personal loan, or medical. Those are really the 3 main unsecured, loans that folks have, meaning credit card, personal loan, and medical. So as we go through this, this person has a higher level of debt stress. They are now looking for an intervention, and in many cases, the only thing that folks know out there in the world is bankruptcy, and they will consider that because they have learned about bankruptcy since they were small. They've heard about that. Many don't know about debt resolution as a stop prior to bankruptcy. And this is, something that we feel that a lot of consumers should consider as an alternative for reasons that we'll talk about. So you struggle with that high interest unsecured debt, and you're not able to make monthly minimums. In many cases, you've gone delinquent on an account. But you haven't necessarily gone delinquent on all those accounts, and in some cases you haven't gone delinquent on any of them, but you know that you're not making progress. You know that every month this is becoming a worse situation, and your balance overall is increasing. So, what is it fundamentally? Fundamentally, it is a solution that will allow a company to work with you to negotiate with those creditors and reduce the amount of the balance that is owed. Okay, so Freddie was talking about with the DMP that your interest rate comes down. So obviously a more aggressive intervention is the actual balance being negotiated down. And that's what debt resolution provides. It allows for that negotiation to happen with those creditors so that you can settle for less than the full amount that you originally owed. And as a result, it provides savings relative to the amount that was enrolled into the program that puts you in a position that over a 2 to 4 year period of time, you can get into a place where you don't have that debt over your head any longer. So how does it work in practice? So when you enroll into the program, you create a separate special purpose savings account. And this is controlled by the consumer, and we refer to it as a dedicated account. They own it, they control it, they can take money out of it at any time that they choose. That's required by the federal law. And the FTC regulated this industry back in 2010 and set up some very specific rules related to how the money could be kept for a period of time before the actual settlement occurs, and what control the consumer has in the program. So that consumer is responsible for making the deposits into this dedicated account, And as the balance on that account becomes larger, then the debt resolution company will reach out to the creditors and will negotiate on the behalf of the consumer. They will then bring those settlements back to the consumer, again, required by law, and the consumer must approve any settlement that has been negotiated. And if they choose not to approve that settlement, then there is no settlement. And that's a choice that a consumer can make at any point. I should also note that in debt resolution programs, the consumer has the right to leave the program at any time that they choose to without any additional fees or penalties at all. Again, that's regulated by the federal government. So it's an important aspect of this program that there are those federal regulations in place to help consumers be protected as part of the process. So when those payments for the reduced debt are processed to the creditors, then there will be basically a work down of that specific debt. And that could happen in a lump sum payment, but typically it doesn't happen that way. It typically will happen in a structured settlement over anywhere from say 3 to 12 months. And so the creditor will get a small amount of what's in the dedicated account for a consumer, and that will pay down that debt over a period of time with no additional interest accruing or any other penalties accruing because the settlement has been reached at that point. So that allows the consumer to get into settlements earlier in the program than having to wait all the way to the end on some of these accounts. Oftentimes what we see is that a consumer will have a number of settlements in the first 6, 12, 18 months, and then they're paying that off mode through their dedicated account to the end of the program. So that's a great feature because then you know that you've got a settlement in place and you're not having to worry about kind of whether or not a settlement will occur. So how do you qualify? There's no requirement in terms of minimum credit score. We have consumers that are in the lowest credit score that you can possibly have, the 400 or 4 500s, and you've got folks that will have a credit score that still is at the high 600s or low 700s. Those are typically consumers that have not yet had the full impact of their inability to make their payments. But they still realize that they need to take some sort of action, otherwise they're going to be defaulting and their credit score is going to be impacted. So the programs do require that there be a hardship, and typically what we're talking about there is a job loss or a divorce or a medical issue or some other life event, as well as going through a specific detailed cash flow analysis or cash flow assessment that looks at your expenses and your income and then shows you what your cash would look like on a monthly basis if you were in the program. And that's aimed at trying to ensure that consumers only come into the program if they have the capability to do so. And if they don't, if their cash situation is in such a bad place that they don't have that kind of income, then bankruptcy is something that they'd want to consider. All right, so what are some of the watch outs? What are some of the concerns that consumers should pay attention to when they consider a debt resolution program? So the first thing is that in order to be in one of these programs, you will go delinquent on those debts. So let's say that you're paying on half of your debts still. As you come into the program and you shift your payment to the dedicated account, those other debts will go delinquent. And that can result in, obviously, collection calls and your credit score being negatively impacted. And it's really important that that expectation be laid out for the consumer clearly and transparently upfront, something that we take a lot of pride in making sure that we do for consumers through multiple disclosures that we provide in our program. In addition, creditors can take, in some cases, legal tactics to get repayment. In those cases, the vast majority of those initiated legal actions are really the beginning of a settlement. as opposed to, you're going to court and having a full engagement with a creditor. It really triggers typically a settlement, but there is legal action, and it can be very concerning for consumers. What most debt resolution providers will do is provide legal support for consumers that are in that case, in case the legal action takes, meaning you'd have representation from a law firm, not the debt resolution company, but a law firm. So third, it's important to recognize that to the extent that there's a reduction in the amount of debt that you have, that there might be a tax liability for that. And I'm not going to go into all the details on it, but forgiven debt can be taxed in some cases. If the consumer is insolvent, however, that tax implication is eliminated. So in the vast majority of the cases, the survey that we've done showed that it was about 80% of the time those consumers are insolvent, and therefore there isn't a tax implication, but 20% of the time there could be. So that's an important thing to know, and again, an important disclosure. And then finally, this is only unsecured debts, federal student loans, mortgages, auto loans. Those are not eligible for this type of program. Okay, so fees. Typically, the fees will be charged, as I mentioned, only at the time that the settlement occurs, and it will typically be between 15 to 25% of the amount of debt that was enrolled into the program for that specific account. So if you had 8 accounts and you settle the first one, you would only pay the fees on the amount for that first account. And when you got to the second one, you'd pay the fees on that account, and so forth. So at the bottom line is the debt resolution companies have a total incentive to ensure that you get settlements that are workable for that consumer, and to have them go through the program, because that's the only way that they can charge fees and ultimately sustain their business model. Okay, let me get to my next slide here. Okay, so we've now addressed 3 of the 4 options, and we've gotten to the final, kind of deepest intervention. Freddie's going to take us through 2 types of bankruptcy, chapter 7 and chapter 13. So Freddie?
All right. Thank you very much, Sean. Yeah, as Sean indicated, bankruptcy is, in some ways, maybe more of a kind of a solution of last resort when the consumer has exhausted other solutions, or when their financial distress is so severe that they need a more, for lack of a better word, aggressive intervention. And, essentially no conversation on debt solutions can be had without talking about bankruptcy. And just like we've presented for the other 3 solutions, we want to arm, consumers with the pros and cons, right? And kind of a balanced view of, hey, what would we want a consumer to know about bankruptcy? All right. So simply put, what is bankruptcy? It's basically a legal process that helps the consumer get out of debt. There are 2 primary forms of bankruptcy. One of them is called Chapter 7, and the other one's called Chapter 13. And we're going to talk about these in greater detail in the next 2 slides. And now, in terms of fees, consumers, again, they should know there's no free lunch, right? So first of all, the consumer should realize that there's going to be court filing fees. Typically, these fees are going to be, a little over $300. And the other fee that the consumer should be aware of is, particularly if they don't qualify for legal aid, or they don't have access to legal aid, there are attorney fees, right? And so, what we've seen in an earlier study, granted this is in an earlier time frame, is that the attorney fees for a Chapter 7 can range somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000. And, one of the studies we've done regarding the attorney fees for Chapter 13, we've seen that average be a little over $3,000. One thing to kind of keep in mind with those numbers is that those numbers were based off of an earlier sample. And so in all likelihood, those fees, those attorney fees, will be likely to be even larger today. Okay. As far as the watch out, one of the things that consumers should be aware of is that the decision to file bankruptcy should not be taken lightly, just because it can impact your credit score for 7 years, and in the case of Chapter 7, for up to 10 years. So, our advice to consumers who are really, considering bankruptcy is make sure you work with an attorney, just to make sure to vet that this is the right decision for you. All right, so we're going to talk about the two different forms of bankruptcy. First one we're going to talk about is Chapter 7. It is the most common form of bankruptcy, and I often refer to it as kind of like a liquidation event. And the reason why is that Chapter 7 bankruptcy, provides relief from debt for the consumers through the selling or the liquidation of the consumer's assets. Right. Now, in terms of how to determine if you're eligible, this is primarily going to be driven by income, right? So, for Chapter 7, if your monthly income is less than the state median, you can qualify. Now, if your monthly income is greater than the state median, you actually have to pass something called a means test. There's a number of criteria. Again, it's going to be dependent on, the state in which you file, but it'll determine whether your income is low enough to file Chapter 7. And these income requirements are, kind of put in place to ensure that consumers don't abuse the bankruptcy system, right? If they can pay their debt back, they should. Okay. Now, in terms of how it works, again, it's a legal process that starts with the filing. Basically, the consumer will provide the courts a bunch of information regarding their financial situation. The court's going to review, this information regarding the consumer's debt, their income, their assets, whatnot. And after the filing, a bankruptcy trustee gets appointed to basically administer the program, right? And the courts are going to basically be looking for assessing the consumer's disposable income, just to truly determine whether or not the consumer can pay the debt back or if they can't. And if they deem that the consumer can't pay the debt back, the debt that the unsecured debt that the consumer has is going to be wiped clean. Now, in Chapter 7, the consumer, again, if the filing is successful, the bankruptcy trustee will sell all of your eligible assets, and the proceeds of those sales will basically be used to pay their creditors back. Whatever debt is left over after all those sales will be discharged or essentially forgiven. And again, what a consumer has to give up is going to be dependent upon the state in which they live in. Okay. Now, in terms of watch-outs, again, with Chapter 7, the consumer is going to need to feel comfortable that if they want kind of, quote unquote, debt forgiveness through Chapter 7, it's going to require that they basically liquidate their assets or basically sell their property, right? And the other important thing to kind of reinforce, we mentioned this before, is that while the assets could be sold to pay off the various debts, a public record will eventually kind of find its way on the credit profile. And as I said earlier, a Chapter 7 information from a Chapter 7 bankruptcy can stay on your credit report for up to 10 years. Okay. All right. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about is a Chapter 13 bankruptcy. I often refer to this as kind of a reorganization of debt. And this is there are aspects of this which are going to be a little more similar to, in this case, debt settlement or debt resolution, because it involves a partial repayment of debt. Okay. Now, in terms of how you qualify for Chapter 13, the bankruptcy code specifies various debt limits that basically define eligibility for filing. But given that there's going to be some type of repayment plan, the consumer must also need to demonstrate that they are employed with a sufficient amount of disposable income basically that allow them to participate in a monthly payment plan. Okay. I'm going to skip the Chapter 13, Chapter 7 for a minute and go to how it works, and then I'll come back to that. In terms of how it works, similar to Chapter 7, there's an initial court filing where a lot of financial information, the consumer's financial information is shared with the courts and the creditors. And then during that process, the consumer proposes a 3 to 5 year payment plan that basically says, okay, hey, this is the amount of disposable income I have, and this is how I'm going to use that disposable income to repay the debt back as much as I can. Typically, it's going to be, they'll only be able to partially repay that. After that, there's a meeting with the creditors where the creditors are given an opportunity to ask the filer, numerous amounts of questions regarding their situation. And ultimately, as the case progresses, there's going to be a determination of whether or not the payment plan is approved or not. And if the payment plan is approved, then the filer will make a monthly payment to a court-appointed bankruptcy trustee, who in turn takes that payment and disperses that to all of the participating creditors. And at the end of the 3 to 5 year plan, whatever debt is left over is forgiven. Okay. Now, in terms of how to decide between Chapter 13 and Chapter 7, the way that I look at it, if I was a consumer kind of contemplating the two, right, it's really going to be driven by two main criteria. The first one is, hey, do I have is my income too large to disqualify me for Chapter 7, right? Because if you're making too much money, the reality is you will not be able to file Chapter 7. Now, if the other consideration is whether or not the consumer is going to be willing to liquidate or to sell their property, right? And so, there are some consumers who maybe they would be, maybe their income qualifies them for Chapter 7, but they really don't want to sell their various properties, to fund the liquidation. So, that's how, I kind of wrap my head around whether or not a consumer should think about Chapter 13 and Chapter 7. In terms of the watch-outs, two main things here. First of all, Chapter 7 is really quick. Typically, those cases resolve in about 4 months. As I mentioned earlier, the Chapter 13 payment plan typically takes between 3 to 5 years, so it's a much longer time frame. Probably the more important thing, we had an opportunity to dig through a lot of bankruptcy data, and one of the things that we learned in our research is that more than half of Chapter 13 filings fail. And the reason why this is relevant is because, unlike some of the other solutions that we mentioned before, such as like debt resolution, there are upfront fees, which means that you have to pay court fees, right? And if you don't have legal aid, you're going to have to pay attorney fees, regardless of whether or not your case is successful, right? And so, given that more than half the filings fail, that also means is that more than half of Chapter 13 filers, they'll actually end up losing more money in the bankruptcy process. And this is one of the, this was, a really interesting, finding for us. And it's something, if I was a consumer, I would want to know and kind of consider, other solutions before potentially exploring Chapter 13. All right. So with that, Sean, do you want to take it home, or do you want me to take it home?
Yeah. I'll just quickly, because I think we've kind of gone through these in pretty great detail, but it's just a good slide, kind of final slide before we get to questions to frame up what we've talked about in terms of each of these elements, kind of what they are. So a clean explanation of what each of them is, and then who they are good for. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you think of this being kind of debt stress spectrum from the left to the right, you'll see that kind of built into the descriptions here, where you're essentially talking about folks who have that better credit and able to self-discipline around their monthly payments on the left side, credit counseling gets you that lower interest rate reduction. I think that's really an important. If I was going to take one thing away between credit counseling and debt resolution, is to understand that credit counseling reduces the interest rate. It doesn't reduce the balance. Okay, so a consumer who can make it through a debt management plan and be successful with it with a lower interest rate is obviously able to avoid some of the downsides of debt resolution, where you've got a negotiated settlement on the balance. On the other hand, if you can't be successful in a credit counseling program by just having a reduction in your interest rate, and you need that reduction in your balance in order to get through the program, then debt resolution is a better option. So again, more stress, debt stress, that's a solution that one should consider. And then when I think about the last two buckets, bankruptcy versus debt resolution, I really think there are three options there, right? Debt resolution, Chapter 13 and Chapter 7. And I think if a consumer, the things I would ask a consumer, and it would be my list if I were out there talking to consumers, it's like, number one, are you willing to sell assets that you have? Number two, are you able to qualify based on the state's means requirements for Chapter 7? And then number three, are you willing to have bankruptcy on your record? If all three of those are yeses, and their consumers comfortable with that, Chapter 7 can be a great option because it is quick, as Freddie pointed out, and it's highly successful. So that's kind of one bucket. If Chapter 7 works for a consumer and on all those criteria, then Chapter 7 can be an awesome option. Chapter 13, on the other hand, I think is a better kind of comparison to debt resolution, and in some ways has some weaknesses in the sense that you've got several of the downsides of bankruptcy, like it being on your record for that period of time. And it doesn't have some of the benefits, which is that you actually don't have to pay up front, but you pay as debts are actually settled in debt resolution. So those two, I think, are much closer kind of competitors to each other or substitutes for each other. And I think understanding where the consumer's head is in terms of what they care about, what their needs are, whether or not they're willing to have bankruptcy on their record, for example, becomes really important in choosing between 13 and debt resolution. To me, that's the toughest decision, I think, for a consumer oftentimes, and one that we think is a really important one to understand both sides of the equation and both options really well before you make it. Okay, so that's the end of our formal presentation. So we've got about 23 minutes, as I understand it, for questions at this point. And I will turn that back over, I guess, to Linda and Nelson then.
Well, Sean and Freddie, thank you both for that fantastic presentation. We must do this one again soon. It was totally awesome. Thank you so much. Nelson, I hear your computer keys clicking. You must have a ton of questions for Sean and Freddie.
Yeah, we do have a few questions here. And I'll start, we'll go work backwards, just clarifying some of the bankruptcy topics that were mentioned. Regarding bankruptcy fees, aren't there fee waivers for low-income litigants? There are in New York. Is that not the case in other jurisdictions? And I know we're going to do a deeper dive in bankruptcy in a few weeks, but we should try to answer some of these if we can.
Yeah, and so I would say so the simple answer there is that there may be some reprieve for fees elsewhere, whether it be through legal aid or other means. But one of the things that we felt is really important to call out, though, is that whether it be the court filing fees or the attorney fees, those still can be a meaningful, a substantial amount of money for the consumer, right? And keep in mind that these are consumers who are already overly indebted.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say, Nelson, is yes. I think if a consumer is able to have go down the bankruptcy path with minimal cost to them, and again is willing to do some of the things that are required of bankruptcy, right? Especially if it's 7, looking at your assets and then that being on your record for long term, it can be a great option. I think Freddie and I, one of the things that we feel strongly about is making sure that there's not a kind of one size fits all type of view around these solutions. And it's a very personal decision based on what consumers are desiring to do in their lives, what they need to get done, and what their their circumstances are. So it's really important that it come down to the individual analysis, not a kind of a broad statement. But again, back to your original question, if the consumer can get access to low cost debt resolution, or I'm sorry, bankruptcy, then I think that's a great solution they should consider.
Great, thank you. And the person asking, just clarified that they are talking about, the reduction in fees through the court itself that's available for litigants. But let me move on, and we are going to get to do more bankruptcy, if not now, if not today, in a few weeks.
Yeah, sounds good.
Before Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the credit card goes to the court, and then there's a lien put on a house. There's a clarification here. Will the Chapter 7 delete the liens on the home that were put on there before the Chapter 7? Do you know anything about that?
I don't have an authoritative answer on that. So unfortunately, I wish I wish I could kind of comment on that more clearly. I don't know specifically.
Okay, that's fine. And again, we are going to focus on that topic soon in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
A couple more on bankruptcy. What percent of people, because you mentioned selling assets, what percent of people need to sell assets in bankruptcy? Do you know? This person says that in their experience, it's so few that selling assets isn't even usually an issue to consider with bankruptcy unless someone has income above the means test.
Yeah, so I don't know what percentage that they have to sell. What we do know is that in that actual process, if they do have non-exempt property that gets included in their filing, there is they will be required to basically sell to sell that property, because essentially what Chapter 7 does is it repays some of the debt, some of the outstanding debt back to the creditors by means of selling this property. Now, granted, a lot of these consumers are going to be financially stressed, and maybe a lot of them also will have low enough income where they may not have many many possessions, which would be required to be liquidated.
Yeah, and I would say, Nelson, in those circumstances, again, I think that it makes a lot of sense then to pursue that, because you've just eliminated one of the major downsides. So again, it really comes down to the consumer's specific situation, and if assets are not relevant for their situation, then obviously that makes bankruptcy more appealing. Chapter 7 specifically.
Great. And then the last question on Chapter 7. Can a person file a Chapter 7 and exempt the mortgage from the filing?
I believe that there are some rules around that. I don't know what, I can't recall that, off the top of my head. But I think it depends on also how much equity they may have in their home. So I think there's a lot of devil in the details on whether or not that gets included or not.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, we could definitely, the legal view of bankruptcy is one that we could provide some information to folks on. At the end of the day, lawyers are going to have the best kind of perspective on the situation, for an individual, and kind of looking at their scenario. And obviously different jurisdictions are different as well. So it's really hard to kind of generically say that it's one way or the other. So I just really encourage folks to, to the extent that bankruptcy is one that is being considered, then you'd want to get that advice, either legal aid or otherwise, from someone that works in that jurisdiction, that understands those laws and the applicability to the individual situation.
Great, thank you then. And then moving on to clarifying some of the earlier topics. For debt consolidation, and this may be a clarification needed here, will the person filing still have access to the credit card and use the card while participating in plan? What's the difference of the different options you talked about? Who still has access to a current credit card?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with debt consolidation, it's up to the consumer which debts are actually consolidated into the new loan. So let's say you take consumer A, who has 5 credit cards, and each of them has, we'll just say $1,000 on them. It would be possible to leave one of the cards out, and you continue to access that, and then pay off the other cards and consolidate that into a new loan. Now, the fact that you've paid off those other 4 cards doesn't mean that you don't have access to them anymore. In fact, those creditors probably, would see that as a positive sign and would want to maybe even increase your amount of credit that's available to you. So you've got to be really careful. One of the most critical things about debt consolidation, and we feel like doing this the right way is just absolutely critical for the consumer, is when you take it out a debt consolidation loan, number one, use that loan to pay off the other credit cards. Okay, that's one mistake that consumers make, which is they'll take out this other loan that they consider to be debt consolidation, but then they don't use it to pay off those other credit cards, and now they're double stuck, right? Because they've built up even more debt. So that's the first really critical thing. And then the second thing is those other credit cards, now that they're paid off, don't run them back up. Be disciplined, stick with the debt consolidation loan as the thing that you're focused on paying down, and only use the other credit cards for kind of, basically running your life day to day, and make sure that gets paid off monthly, right? That would be the path to success in that channel.
Great, thank you. And then here's a couple of related questions, and I'll pose them both, and feel free to answer them as you want. If a consumer who's part of a debt resolution program stops making payments, they might get sued by creditors, right? And what kind of assistance does the debt resolution company offer in that situation? That's question one, or part one. But then there's also a question of if a debt resolution hires a law firm, say, that is working with it, and then the law firm fails to get cases dismissed or fully cleared up, does that law firm also at times have the consumer waive important legal defenses that would mean that the consumer doesn't have to pay the debt, but perhaps as part of the process they've waived certain defenses that they could bring up later?
Okay, well let me start, and then Freddie can chime in if I don't get through it properly. But if the consumer is in a debt resolution program and they stop making payments into the dedicated account, then there's going to be the inability to go forward and negotiate further settlements. Any that have been negotiated up to that point, and there's sufficient money in the dedicated account, would be resolved. But future ones would not be able to be resolved, and those creditors absolutely could, go after you for collections, and/or there could be a legal action. And so that's a really important thing to understand, is if consumers are, in a situation where they're unable to make the monthly payments required in the debt resolution program, they really should consider the more aggressive alternative of bankruptcy for example. So Nelson, does that answer that first one?
Yes. Well, and is there any kind of assistance offered to a consumer who gets sued after, or do you refer them to
Yeah.
legal aid?
Yeah. So yes. So and I don't want to speak for all debt resolution companies. I'll just tell you what we do. We have a law firm network that when a consumer gets into a situation where they have been sued as part of that program, then we'll have a law firm that will represent them. Now, if they have stopped making payments, they have essentially opted out of the program. So we won't have an ongoing obligation. Let's say that they've determined that they are not going to make payments into this program. They've gone to do something else. They then will need to deal with the collections and/or legal actions that would occur post effectively leaving the program, right? Because to stay in the program, you do need to make your payments in a dedicated account.
Great, thank you.
Yep. And then
Yeah,
you asked another question, I guess, around legal defenses. I think the answer on that one is I can't speak to what any specific kind of law firm would do. Obviously, giving up legal defenses that would make sense to support a consumer, that does not sound like a good strategy. And the goal ultimately is to help the consumer get into a place where they are able to settle with any creditor that is taking legal action. And by the way, the percentage of creditors that take legal action in this way has diminished very significantly over the last 5 years. And in fact, during COVID, that practice effectively stopped. And it has not come back to pre-COVID levels at all. Basically, it has diminished meaningfully. Most creditors are not going down the path when someone's in a debt resolution program of bringing legal action. Most creditors are settling directly. I mean, the vast majority. It is a handful of creditors that still will, go out of their way to take a legal action, and it's something that we feel creditors should not do. That they should recognize that consumers are in a debt stress situation, that they're trying to make their best effort to work out of that situation through a debt resolution program, or committed to that, and the additional stress of a lawsuit is not an appropriate step from a creditor. That's our position and our belief. So we would hope that practice would end eventually completely. It has diminished very much over the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, that's good news. We had several questions from many people asking in different ways. If a consumer wants to find a debt resolution company, are they accredited? How do you know which one's going to be legitimate and which one might be predatory, since there is some history in this sector?
Yeah.
Where do you find? Is there a list of the top 5?
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah,
vet?
I think that's a great question. I think that obviously you can rely on reviews online that can be valuable, like with the BBB, for example, or even reviews like through organizations like a Trustpilot, as an example. I do think that there's an industry association where all the companies that are part of the industry association, called the American Fair Credit Council, AFCC, that group commits themselves to living by the rules and regulations promulgated by the federal government, and specifically that there won't be any fees charged up front to consumers, meaning you'll only charge fees when the consumer has access to a settlement and they've approved it. I would say if I were talking to consumers, I would say the number one thing to watch out for would be a debt resolution company that is charging fees upfront. That is not compliant with the law, and it is a big red flag in terms of their ultimate commitment to your success. And so that's where I would focus in as your number one criteria. And then from there, I think using, the internet to look at reviews and really digging in on any debt resolution company that you're considering, by going and seeing what complaints have been levied or what reviews have been provided, that is a good thing. The reality is that, if you look at the CFPB's complaint board and the number of complaints that happen with debt resolution versus other solutions, debt resolution is very relatively low compared to other solutions. It's not perfect, and never would argue that it is. And as you mentioned, there are some in the industry that will not live by all the rules, but it has changed dramatically since the regulations were created in 2010.
Great, thank you. And then another question and clarification and question. It is the debt resolution company that is doing the settlement negotiation, right, with the creditors. And then is there any negotiation about, getting a positive mark in the credit report related to as part of the settlement? Or is it just about, what's going to be paid?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the debt resolution company works directly with the creditor to do the settlement. That work is then presented to the consumer. So the only thing that the consumer needs to do is effectively review that settlement and then approve the settlement. All the work on the negotiation is done by the debt resolution company. And regarding the way that it shows up on a credit report, there's no negotiation around how that shows up. As I understand it, it will show up as a debt that is paid but not in full. Freddie can probably tell us the specific language. So it will show up as something other than a paid in full settlement, but the impact in terms of sticking with you like a bankruptcy is meaningfully diminished, as compared to being in a situation where you're delinquent and you don't ever resolve that debt. Fred, do you have any specifics on how it shows up on the credit report, given that's an area of expertise for you?
You bet. So as you said, first of all, it's going to be dependent on two things. It's going to be dependent on the bureau, right? Certain bureaus will have codes for settled. Other bureaus will have a code for paid in full, but less than the full amount. But more importantly, it's also going to be dependent upon how the lenders report. Some lenders won't, put a code indicating that it was settled. It'll just kind of show up as kind of, charged off debt, right? So there may be some variability in reporting there. But by and large, it's an indication that it was paid for less than the original agreed upon balance.
Great, thank you. And then someone's asking, what about debt that has already gone to quote unquote collections? Is there still help in debt resolution?
It's a good question. Yes, if it's gone to collections, there absolutely would be included in the program, and there can be help there because you can negotiate directly with the collector. If something has gone to litigation prior to a consumer being in touch with us, we can't deal with those that are already in litigation. So yes, collections, yes, litigation, no.
Great, thank you. And then is there, we had a question for, is there any kind of help for small businesses? Do you know?
Well, it's interesting. Many of the small, many of the folks that come to us that have a significant amount of debt on their credit cards are effectively small businesses, right? They're sole proprietors who have put debt onto their credit cards, their personal credit cards, oftentimes, and have gotten out over their skis. So we will work with, say, a sole proprietor or someone to that. Now, business debt itself, so for example, with a supplier, so forth, debt resolution typically does not address that. But anything on the credit card certainly is it's possible to bring that into the program if it's a personal credit card. And I'm not aware of a small business debt resolution service, to be honest with you. It's a much smaller market than the personal, debt resolution space. And I think that many of those consumers that are small businesses, they end up with debt on their personal credit cards and so forth. So they are eligible for this debt resolution program.
Great, thank you. And since we have a credit expert on hand, let's take advantage. Somebody's asking, they work with seniors and disabled folks who maybe have credit that is pretty old, nothing recent, and want to work on improving credit. Do you guys have any, what tips do you offer folks who are going to rebuild their credit after all of this?
Yeah, so in terms of having, what we would call like a stale credit profile, right? Where they do have a credit history, but let's say, there's no recent activity on it. I'd say that just the number one tip in terms of rebuilding credit is definitely start out slow and live within their means, right? And so typically, probably the safest solution would be to get either a low limit credit card, or maybe even a secured card that reports to all three bureaus, and then use the card for certain types of transactions, let's say gas or something like that. But more importantly, make sure that they pay in full every month. And just the notion of having one account that gets paid in full every month, right? That kind of refreshes the credit report. It'll make them eligible for a valid score again. And that's probably the best way to go. And I would say that's sage advice, not only for kind of older consumers really kind of trying to refresh their credit, but it's also for consumers who've kind of been through the ringer, looking for a fresh start, and are, trying to rebuild their credit. And I'd say, the other thing that we want to encourage for those consumers is just really make sure, the second time around with credit that they live within their means.
Great, thank you so much. And then someone's asking, we talked about how to vet debt resolution companies, but in terms of debt management plans or the credit counseling, someone suggested the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. Do you know of other resources?
Now that's essentially the equivalent of the industry association I mentioned on the debt resolution side. I think that's the right approach there as well. And you can again go online and do some specific digging. The way I'd look at it is maybe go to those association sites to get the broad view of what the options are. But then once you start to focus in on one or two or three, and then do the individual research for each one of those. And I know that's a lot of work, but these are pretty big decisions in people's financial lives, and worth some effort up front to make sure that you're picking the right company. And then the final thing I would say on choosing any of these organizations to support you is talking with them. Get on the phone and see that there's a human being on the other side of the phone that is going to ask good questions of you, try to understand your situation, help you understand your options, and then collectively, you come together for there being a path to go forward. If a company or an organization does that well, and you're engaging with them and you feel that trust, that's a really good sign. As opposed to getting into a situation where you feel as though you're being sold on a specific program, you're being told this is the only way to do it. That kind of hard kind of salesmanship, as it were, is often a sign of a company that isn't going to be as supportive as you go through whatever program you've chosen.
Great, thank you. And so that National Foundation for Credit Counseling, they offered the website. The person was nfcc.org. And then and then we're going to wrap up in just a moment. You already told us that student loans don't qualify for debt resolution. We just had a webinar on student loans, so I'm going to drop in the resources for that. But did you want to say anything else about it?
Well, what I'll say, actually, private student loans can be eligible for the debt resolution program, but the vast majority of loans out there right now are public. And so the public student loans, you've kind of got to deal directly with the government on those, and that's why you find that they aren't brought into debt resolution programs, on a consistent basis.
Excellent. Well, I did drop a link to our last video or webinar on the topic in the chat. And I'll turn it over to Linda. We are running over time, so thank you so much for those questions and answering.
Thank you, Nelson, and thanks once again to Sean and Freddie for great presentations. If you are interested in contributing to consumer action, if you would like to contribute, you can do so online by credit card or PayPal by going to www.consumer-action.org/give it, or you can mail us a check. Attention membership given, 57 Post Street, 611 San Francisco, California, 94104. And again, I would like to thank our sponsor once again, give them a shout out to Achieve for supporting our mission and helping us bring you this relevant and timely information. And if you would like to support us, you can do so by subscribing to our YouTube channel. If we get 200 people to subscribe today, we will have accomplished our goal. So click on that link and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is free and it would help us continue to bring you these great webinars free. Again, a special thanks to our guest speakers, Sean and Freddie, for those excellent presentations. I'm telling you, we need to do this again. I can't wait to hear what you think about today's webinar. So please remember to complete the survey. We value your feedback as we strive to bring you timely, relevant information that's going to make a difference in the lives of the consumers that you serve. So that's all we have for you today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for submitting your questions and keeping the webinar moving. A link to today's recording will be released soon, so watch your inbox. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for your service. Thank you for helping all of those members in your community. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Linda.